Verhelok Sol. I am Skeggy and welcome to the Norse Code. Today is going to be a little bit different because today we are doing a episode in my crafting series, which usually is only on YouTube. But I'm going to try to do this one for the podcast as well because there's going to be a lot of history involved in it. However, if you are listening to this on the audio-only podcast, jump over to the YouTube, and I suggest you watch this one there because there's going to be a lot of visuals. I also have some other crafting videos on there to help in reenactment or different crafts for the faith and such. And I'll be adding more as time goes on. So what is it that we're talking about today? We're talking about this, my new shield. So let's talk a little bit about Viking shields. And as we talk about the shields, I'm going to talk about how I built this one and show some clips because I filmed the whole process. So a shield construction during the Viking era, typically a shield was 32 to 36 inches, which is 80 to 90 centimeters for those outside the United States. However, there have been some found as big as 37 inches, 94 centimeters, and as small as 28 inches or 78 centimeters. And they range in thickness from from a quarter inch thick up to a half inch thick, tapering towards the edges. That's 6 to 12 millimeters. And some have been as thick as 1 1/8 inches or 30 millimeters, which is a really thick, really heavy shield. There's some evidence for that in the sagas, as well as at least one archaeological find of a shield that thick. However, most, especially like the Gokstad shields, which is the most prevalent number of shields that we have archaeologically, they range from a quarter inch to a half inch at the center, and then they taper towards the edges. It definitely seems to, and this is not a fact, but it seems that shields were made for the individual. Oftentimes you're either making your shield yourself, or if there was somebody who would make shields for a living, they'd make it to fit you. Too big is obviously bad because it covers more but it's heavier. But too small is either you're not going to protect yourself well enough, or it's not going to be good in the shield wall. Now there's a lot of talk about the shield wall. Did Vikings actually use the shield wall? If you watch the Vikings TV show, you see them do it all the time. It makes sense that they would do it, especially with how much of a Roman influence there is. I mean, look at the Viking sword. It looks just like a gladius. But there's really no evidence whatsoever of Vikings actually using a shield wall. It doesn't mean they didn't. We just don't know. So all surviving archaeological finds of Viking shields have a butted construction, which means that each plank is just butted up against each other and glued in place, and then all the other the reinforcements and everything that go along with it. However, in several of the sagas, as well as the Gulathing laws, which is a group of laws that dictated how shields were supposed to be made, they describe a laminate type shield construction in which you have thinner boards that you have some that run horizontally and then another layer that run vertically, and this is done to strengthen the shield, allow you to use gluing shields together like that. You're going to have a lot less movement, you're going to have a lot less chances of them breaking. However, we don't have any surviving examples of those. Instead, we have the butted construction, which is what my shield is. Now, my shield is 31 inches in diameter. It does have a butted construction, so individual planks. It is 3/8 of an inch, which is 8 millimeters, thick at the center, and it tapers down to about a quarter of an inch of wood at the ends, but then there's rawhide on the edges, which thickens up the edges anyway. Like I said, I used a butted construction for mine. Now, Ideally, what I would have done is go to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy 3/8 inch planks and start gluing them together. However, after going to 6 stores, nobody had what I needed. Either they didn't have 3/8 inch planks, or they had them but they were only 2 feet long. And I wanted at least a 30-inch shield. I ended up going with 31, but I wanted at least 30 inches. So I ended up taking a 2x6, and since I have the tools available to me, I ripped them down into smaller planks and put them together, glued them up to make the shield. I then cut out the outer diameter, and then on the inside you get another circle cut out big enough for your shield boss and for your hand to fit in there. And that's essentially the construction of the body of the shield. Now, like I said, I used 2x6s, so that's pine. I was going to go with poplar because that's a harder wood, but I couldn't find that. Now, historically, all surviving shields are evergreen, so spruce, fir, pine. However, these sagas claim that shields are made out of linden wood, which in America we know as basswood. Now, if you've ever used basswood, it's a very lightweight wood, which is great for a shield. It's also very soft wood. It's fantastic for carving. I love basswood for carving, but I don't know how good of a shield that really makes. Sometimes you find basswood guitars. I actually have a guitar somewhere over here that's made out of basswood, and so it is a usable wood. I just question how good it would be for a shield. However, I will say that lind, L-I-N-D, means shield in Old Norse. Now, the boss. So, the shield boss is a metal dome that goes over that hole in the center and protects your hand. It allows you to hold the shield in the center with your hand protruding through the shield and still be protected. Now, mine here is domed, and that is accurate. You often find domed shield bosses. However, there are some that were pointy or flat. The flat was probably just easier to manufacture. The pointy would often have little ridges on it that if you got a spear or a sword or an axe stuck in it, you can kind of control it and move it so it's out of your way. I went with the domed. I like the look of it better. I think it makes more sense. And considering I forged the dome myself, it was a lot easier to forge that. Now, I've made a shield before, and I bought the shield boss. You can get them on Amazon for like $25. They're not much. But I wanted to forge my own, so I got some, I believe it was 16 or 18 gauge steel, and I started hammering away. It took me a couple hours. My arm is really sore. I'm not going to go through in detail how to do it because I don't think I did it the best possible way. I did it the best way I could with what I had. But there are a lot of YouTube videos on how to forge a shield boss that will do a much better job than me explaining how to do it. Now, typically, historically, a shield boss was 6 inches in diameter, or about 15 centimeters. Mine is roughly that as well. It actually might be a little bit bigger than 6 inches, maybe by like a quarter inch or so. But they're usually made out of 6 to 10 gauge iron, or 3 to 5 millimeters. So that's fairly thick, a lot thicker than what mine is. However, like I said, I only have limited tools for forging. I certainly don't have the right tools for armoring, which is the tools you need to make a shield boss. And I did the best I could with what I got. And the fact of the matter is, I'm not going into battle with this shield. So a little thinner is probably okay. Now, the shields the shield bosses are attached with nails. I don't know how well you can see them on camera, but I do have these broad-headed nails. What I did was I bought nails and threw them into my forge and kind of reshaped them a little bit to make them look more hand forged, mainly because I just didn't have the time to hand forge nails from scratch. It also requires a couple tools that I don't have yet. Now those nails go through the shield boss, through the shield, and then on the back they're either flattened, which is kind of riveting it, so you heat up the one end and just pound it flat and creates a rivet, or you could do what I did, which is also a historically accurate way, and that's bend them. Now you could go the easy way and just bend them over, or you can do what I did, which is throw a pair of pliers on it, and so you put that first bend above, about a half inch above the shield, so now the nail's coming through and then bends, and then you bend the whole thing over, so the point of that nail ends up going back into the shield, and it almost creates like a staple. So that's the way I did it. It is a historically accurate way to do it. It's also a very secure way to do it. So now let's talk about the grip. So typically, well, almost exclusively, you have a board that runs the full length of your shield, going right through the center, typically angled on both ends, with the middle portion usually wrapped in leather or suede. Mine's wrapped in suede to be your handle, and that goes right over where your shield boss is. It is usually wood. That's the most common. However, there have been a few archaeological finds that show that you could also do it out of iron, and oftentimes those would be forged right into the shield boss. I wasn't ready to do that. Plus, I like the wooden ones better. Then there's also reinforcing. These are not always found on the archaeological finds. However, it is in the sagas and some of the laws, it is written that you shall do this. Sometimes they're wood, sometimes they're iron, depending on where you are, when you are. I went with wooden ones. I did consider going with iron, but I felt like wood made more sense. Now the Gullithing laws required iron, but as you'll see as we continue to go through this, the Gullithing laws were not always followed. And these were attached with glue and nails, and the nails were done the same way as the boss. So they go through the front with a broadhead nail, through the shield, through the reinforcement, bent over and stapled in. Now, our edge banding. Well, let's talk about the facing first. Now, some shields were faced with either leather or rawhide, and there's a few YouTube videos out there who are doing historically accurate shields that did it with rawhide, and I think rawhide's probably your best option because that hardens. You get to wet it, you wrap it around the shield, and then it hardens really hard. Rawhide's fantastic for that, and it makes the shield just about impervious, which is what you want. However, cow rawhide is way too thick for that. Goat rawhide would be preferable. However, you need a really big goat. And trying to find that nowadays is very, very difficult and very costly. So I went with the other option, which is linen. And we do find these. This is a historically accurate way to do it. And what you do is you put a layer of glue. Now, historically, you would use hide glue. I used wood glue because it's what I had, and it's also a better glue. It's probably the only non-historically accurate way I did it, other than buying the nails. But yeah, you put a layer of glue over the face of your shield. You put your linen or your leather or your rawhide down. And if you're doing the leather or rawhide, that's it. You weigh it down, you let the glue dry. If you're doing the linen, you put another layer of glue on top and you kind of work it in. So it kind of works like fiberglass. We put down resin, then fiberglass, and then resin on top, and it all kind of intermingles together to create a much harder and stronger surface. Now, the edging, I used rawhide. This is cow rawhide. However, goat rawhide would be more historically accurate and a little bit easier to work with. But again, that's hard to come by, and cow rawhide is not unheard of for edge banding. Now, the banding is wrapped around both the front, over the edge, and towards the back, and it's either stitched or nailed on. Now, I went with stitched because, again, it makes more sense to me that it would be stitched rather than nailed. You also get a nice even pressure all the way around it. However, nailing would certainly be a whole lot easier. But I went with stitching and kind of cut my fingers open doing it. If you're watching the video, you can probably see why. Editing Skeggy here. As I'm putting this together, I realize I forgot an important part of the shield construction, and that is the edge banding that goes underneath the rawhide. Now what you're seeing here is rope edging that got glued to the edge of the shield prior to the rawhide being sewn on. Now there is no archaeological evidence to suggest that Vikings did this. There is also no written evidence to suggest that Vikings did this. However, this was common practice to edge your shields with rope throughout medieval Europe. England, France, Spain, Germany, all of them wrapped the edges of their shields with rope. What this did was it added an extra layer of protection between the weakest part of your shield, which is the edge, and the oncoming sharpened end of a weapon. And while there is no evidence that the Vikings did this, from a practical perspective, they probably did. Even if it wasn't until later in the Viking era, as they are invading the rest of Europe and seeing how Europeans were doing things, that they probably picked up this practice because it is just good practice. So I went ahead and did that with my shield. Now, there are some sagas that describe metal edge banding, so iron. I think there's only one archaeological find that had iron edge banding. Generally, they're either rawhide or no banding. However, if they're no banding, chances are it just didn't survive the last 1,000 years. But you can do steel or iron edge banding and still be considered historically accurate, even though it's not common. There is also archaeological evidence for iron or bronze little clamps around the edges. It is unknown at this point whether that was structural, like that was helping hold on the edge banding, or if it was purely decorative. The more likely scenario is it's repairs. You go into battle, you get hit on the edge of the shield with a sword, it cuts your rawhide, and so you put this clamp on over it to kind of protect that area. That's probably what it is. And at some point, I'll probably add a couple of those clamps onto here just to make my shield look a little bit more used and accurate. Now, let's talk about the painting. Archaeological findings vary quite a bit. At Gokstad, you have typically black and yellow pigments were found. We don't know exactly what the pattern was, but we know they were black and yellow. At Trelleborg, they were red and white. Again, we don't know the pattern, but we know what pigments were there. The Gullithing laws states that shields are to be red and white, specifically like a quartered. So you have one quarter of it red, the next quarter white, then red, then white, which is a very common type of shield that you see when you see recreations of Viking shields. Norwegian laws state that Red shields, like solid red shields, indicate hostile intent. So you would use those shields when you're ready for war, which, if you're not ready for war, why would you have a shield in the first place? Well, other than like personal squabbles and whatnot, but still. And then most shields were treated with oil, inside, outside, around, front, back, all over, and this would make them watertight. They're probably oiled at least once a year, if not multiple times a year, and this is to keep water from entering into the wood and causing the wood to swell, which would break your glue joints and it would crack. If it didn't break it as it was swelling, it would swell, and as it would shrink, the wood itself would crack. Your edge banding, if it's rawhide, or if your front face is rawhide, when it gets wet, it gets soft, and then you lose that protection that you get from it being hardened rawhide. It also would become really, really heavy. I don't know if you ever picked up waterlogged wood, but it's very, very heavy, and a shield is going to be heavy enough as is. So mine is treated with a coat of oil. I don't plan on having mine out in the rain very often, if ever, so I probably will only do one coat of oil every year, but who knows? I may end up changing that depending on how life goes. Now, let's take a moment and talk about the specific pattern that I have on this shield. You look at it and you may think, oh, that looks very similar to Lagatha's shield from the Viking show, and yes, it is similar, but it is also different. For those listening on the audio only, my shield is a red shield with a black stripe going from the top down to the bottom, right through the center, and then two black chevrons going through the center of it. Now, Lagatha's shield is a little bit different. I'll throw a picture on the screen, and you can see it's similar in concept but different in execution. I did not make this shield to mimic Lagatha's shield. I made this shield to mimic an ancestor's shield. Now, you may be wondering how I know what my ancestor's shield looks like. That's a little bit of a story. You may believe this, you may not believe this, but this is what happened and this is what I'm going with. About a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, I was doing mediumship exercises every Wednesday night, and one of the people there sometimes would pick up on somebody for me, and over a couple sessions they were able to describe them to me, and then through my own meditations I was able to connect with this person as well. They are a spirit guide for me. They are an ancestor of mine. They are they were a Norse warrior. His name is Loki. He's not the god Loki, but his name was Loki. He would oftentimes I see him with longer, like shoulder length hair, like a dirty brown, almost reddish, short beard. He's typically, I see him, he's wearing a red tunic with gold colored, like yellow orangish kind of bandings. And at one point I saw his shield, and as I'm doing these meditations, I'm trying to see his shield more and more, and the more I do these meditations, the shield is becoming clearer over time, and eventually what I see is this design on the shield. I then went back to this medium that first introduced me to this ancestor of mine, and asked her if she ever saw the shield, and she said she did. So I sent her the file, like I drew this up, and I sent it to her, and asked her not to open it, and instead describe it to me, and then open it. So she described it to me, then opened it, and sure enough, what she saw was this design. So when I decided I wanted to make a historically accurate shield, I knew I needed to honor my ancestor and make his shield. I'm also planning on making another tunic. I got to get some nice wool and make a red tunic, and I've already found some woven trim that I'm going to use, but it's not it's not cheap, so I got to save up some money and buy that stuff. I would make it myself, but I just don't have the time. So that's where this pattern came from. If you go on to our site, our Shopify site, which will have a link down in the description, you can actually buy shirts and hoodies with this shield design on it. I'm planning on making some hats with it as well. And this is just going to become a symbol of the channel. So that is my shield. One last little piece of information on historically accurate Viking shields is towards the end of the Viking era, you start seeing more kite shields. So this is your typical round shield, but at the bottom, it comes down to a point, giving you a little bit more protection, and it kind of looks like a kite, hence why it's called a kite shield. Like I said, these started popping up towards the end of the Viking era. These probably started in Normandy, who were the ancestors of Vikings, because that's where we find the oldest examples of kite shields. But then they kind of traverse across Northern Europe. They're a very great shield. They offer all the same benefits of the round shields the Vikings had, with the added benefit of covering a little bit more of your body. And it just dawned on me that I forgot one very important piece of information about Viking shields. There's no arm strap. You hold this by the center. There is no strap to hold the shield to your arm like in other medieval shield examples. There's positives and negatives that go with that. A negative is that you have to carry the full weight in your hand. Other shields that strap to your arm, now you can use your full arm to hold up the shield, and it's a little bit easier to carry bigger, heavier shields. However, the benefit of only having it in your hand is that it can twist. This is very useful in combat. If they hit on one side, it can actually twist, opening up the lane on the other side for you to stab or swing your axe. If you can swing the other way, and you can use the momentum of it twisting to kind of twist your body around, opening up a side for you to swing. It also allows you to use your shield as an offensive weapon. If you go watch Captain America, he often uses his shield as an offensive weapon, hitting people with the edge of it, which is something you can very much do with one of these shields. And in fact, as people are trying to recreate the Viking way of fighting, there are a few people who believe that the shield was your primary offensive weapon and your axe or your sword was your defensive weapon, which is the complete opposite of what you would think it would be. But you can basically beat people with the shield while deflecting their sword or axe or or spear with your other weapon, which would be more maneuverable. And then once you kind of beat them down, you can just kind of stab them, hit them with the axe, and just be done with them and move on to the next guy. But we don't know any of that for sure. We're just speculating at this point. But that covers the Viking shield. I certainly hope you learned something. I hope I inspired you to maybe make your own shield. If you don't want to be completely historically accurate and you just want something to hang up on the wall, you could just go buy some plywood, cut the circle, maybe put the linen on it just for you get the right texture. You could use a pleather for the edge banding if you don't want to go the route of rawhide, or a fake suede or something just to give you the look. Paint it the way you want, hang it on the wall. I have one of those too. It was my very first shield that I made, and I was more interested in having one than doing it historically accurate. And when I decided to make another one, this one I wanted to be accurate. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you watched this on YouTube and you got to see how I was making all this, and I hope you enjoyed it and it inspired you. So until next time, Helse thu ok hugen godum, Thor thick thegi, Odin thick eggy. Hail to you and be in good spirits. May Thor protect you and Odin keep you.